Awesome. Thanks a lot, John, for coming on the show this week. I appreciate you giving me some of your time.
Happy to be here.
And I'm glad you invited me out to your studio here. It's a nice dead sounding room.
Yeah. It's pretty well balanced. It took me about a year to build it.
Okay.
Actually. Yeah. I had someone design it for me.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And so he designed it and then you implemented the design?
Yeah. He designed it and he has this whole database of different schematics.
Okay.
So then he just sends you all the schematics and you build it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very cool. So then and he'll give you so anyone who, obviously the listeners can't see it, but there's there's no parallel walls and there looks to be like some baffling right kind of behind me. So reflections, I'm guessing, are kind of like dispersed.
Mm-hmm.
And okay.
Yeah, for most sound stuff, it's a combination of absorbing the sound and then diffusing the sound. So, in other words, like getting rid of reflections.
Okay.
Because you don't want it totally dead. Mm-hmm. So there's some of these are just like big sections of insulation of varying densities. Mm-hmm. Some sections actually have big, like really thin metal sheets suspended in them.
Okay.
That are sealed in rubber to create like a kind of like a reverse speaker almost for really low frequencies. That's the hardest stuff, is the super low frequencies.
The low frequencies. Okay.
Yeah.
Is that where you would get like standing waves? Is that is that what the low frequencies would be causing those, or?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah.
And what about floating floors? Do you have is that a thing in here? A floating floor?
Yeah, that's more, that is more, because there's two ways you can think about sound. Like, it's trying to get it sounding good in the room, and then there's soundproofing that keeps it from going out of the room.
Okay.
Or sounds outside of the room coming in.
Okay.
So the floating floor is a little more, like in a typical studio where you're trying to maybe isolate one room from the other. So the drums don't bleed through, or you're just trying to like contain it within the space.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it might be more of like a tracking studio type situation.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Very cool. So yeah, I'd love to dive into a bunch of the mastering, the lingo, and kind of nerd out a little bit. But I wanted to ask you one question in particular because it jumped out to me. I had an interview. It was actually like a video interview. I just saw you on YouTube just a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay. Yeah.
You mentioned that after like years of being an artist, you were excited that you were working in music, but it wasn't all about you.
Yeah.
And I kind of had a similar feeling once I walked away from writing and releasing music and started working at the radio station. Mm-hmm. And I found this like quite a bit of joy in building up other people or like presenting music to the world.
Yeah.
So I'd just be curious to hear you talk more about that if you don't mind.
Yeah, well, I think it's in that same spirit that I really like being able to help artists get across the finish line. Mm-hmm. I like that kind of from a sonic standpoint. I can help them like just take their project to a little higher level. I like being involved in that last moment when it's high anxiety for them because I've been through it so many times and I know what that feels like.
Okay.
So I like being able to be there and just reassure them that it's fine. Because I'm the last person who will do anything to the tracks before they, land on vinyl or go out to streaming or whatever.
Yep.
So sometimes people just need to hear like, we're good. Like it sounds great.
Okay.
Nothing to worry about here. Like send it.
Okay.
So I enjoy kind of being able to help people through that last little process. And I like that. I think when you're an artist, there's a certain amount of inherent judgment that you have to have on your own art and kind of in how you view other art, because you're always assessing, not that it's like fully a negative thing, but you're always assessing like, is this something that I like?
Okay.
Do I not like it? Because you just have to kind of create this like discriminant taste for things, right? Like I like that. I want to do something like that. I don't like that. I don't want that to be a part of what I do. Mm-hmm. Because it's kind of the thing where it's like, if you're too open-minded with what you're doing musically, like your brain will just fall out and, you won't have any direction to what you're doing.
Yeah.
But I don't have to live in that headspace anymore because I'm kind of given something that already has a direction.
Yep.
So I don't have to create the direction. I just have to help refine the direction.
Okay.
And it just kind of come at it from like a judgment-free space where I'm not assessing kind of the quality of the art.
Okay. Yeah.
If that is even possible. Mm-hmm. But yeah, I think as an artist, you kind of have to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Even if it's subjective, you do have to do it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So So I don't have to do that anymore. And I just kind of meet the track wherever it is, and then just like help it kind of refine itself.
Okay.
Yeah, from there. So my judgment, if I'm making any, I don't want to say even judgments, assessments, I'm thinking like, how is the balance of the low end to the high end?
Okay.
So it's not, there is room for a little bit of creativity within there.
Yeah.
Depending on genre or whatnot, but it's much more within a certain range.
Okay.
So there's a large objective piece to what I do that is just not technical, but like it's got to fit within a certain box. And then there's a little bit of subjective wiggle room within that box, if that makes sense. So
yeah.
My margins are smaller on the creative side. So it's not entirely like void of creativity, but just the space I'm working with. Okay. And I'm not the original spark. I don't have the pressure of being the original spark.
Okay. Yeah. You get to come in and put like the icing on the cake.
Yes.
Sort of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think as I've got older too, I've realized that maybe having less options can make you more creative. So you mentioned like you have a little bit of space to be creative, but maybe in some way that unlocks the creativity in some weird way.
Yeah, I think so. That's something I definitely employed as an artist, was I'd put restrictions around myself in writing to try and remove things that I would normally use as a crutch.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you would put those boundaries, like you'd make up your own boundaries. So you, like, the paradox of choice or being paralyzed by choice is like a common issue, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
For sure.
Very cool. You mentioned too, but like thinking about the creativity in terms of the mastering, like what comes to my mind is like, I imagine you're putting on some compression or limiting to most of your masters.
Yeah.
So is that always about dynamic range, or are you playing with like the attack and release to like help the groove like change at all, or like how would that unfold?
Yeah, so it depends. It's a little different perspective for mastering. I mean, the limiting is almost always there unless it's some kind of jazz or classical project, or ironically, a quiet folk tune will often need less limiting.
Okay.
Because loudness is... it's tricky because everyone talks about loudness, and it's very trendy now to talk about like, God, everything should be minus 14 LUFS or whatever, but they're literally just numbers, and loudness is something you experience, and it's not just a number. So for example, if I had a rock track that was at -9 and it was just like solid, loudish rock track, if I matched an acoustic tune on the track that was just, say, even like a vocal and acoustic guitar, if I put that to -9, it would blow away the rock track.
Okay.
Because the vocal would seem so loud, right? That it would just, and the vocal would seem like a giant. Because you've taken all the space allotted in the box and you filled it with a vocal. Okay. The picture is like a giant head. And but for the rock track, you have the same size box. Yeah. But like you got to fit the vocal in there along with everything else. So you kind of have to like shrink it down to fit in that space. So a lot of times, so like levels within an album are often dictated by the vocal balance, so that the vocal is experienced at a similar level throughout it. Okay. And the rock track still hits you like a rock track. Yeah. And isn't buried by the ballad. Okay.
That was going to be a question, actually. I was wondering how you go from, so you're talking like track to track on the same album, high energy rock tune, and you hit next, or the next track comes on, it's their ballad or their folky tune.
Yeah.
So it's kind of about the vocal, making the vocal hang out in a an expected way or anticipated or just a comfortable way. Like how do you think about it?
I think ideally so it hits them right emotionally. And it doesn't send them reaching for the volume knob to either turn it up or down.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah.
That makes me think of like, you must have been familiar with the loudness wars or whatever, like in the 90s and the early aughts or whatever they call it.
It's still happening.
It's still happening?
Yeah, I mean, it's optional now, but in reality, like people still want their tracks loud. Okay. If I have one common revision, it's can it be louder?
Can it be louder? Yeah, okay.
The answer is always yes.
Okay. So what happens when you get some tracks? So some listeners might not understand that mastering, for the most part, now I don't know if like people send stems anymore, but like, are you generally working with just a stereo track?
Yes. Yep. Just the left and right track.
Okay. Whereas like a mix, anyone who's familiar with mixing, you could have anywhere from 4 to 48, 100 tracks at this point, right?
So, which means I don't technically have the ability to move the levels of the individual tracks.
Yeah.
So if they, like, the level of the vocal compared to everything else should be already set and all of that. So anything I do affects everything.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's where it can get tricky if you have, say, a really bright snare drum, but the vocal is kind of dull.
Okay.
And they want to brighten the vocal, but as they brighten the vocal, that already bright snare drum gets brighter as well. So that's where you get into some kind of tricky positions.
And you have to find like a happy medium maybe, or like split
yeah, you can kind of sneak around it. Sometimes you can find a place to brighten the vocal that the snare drum isn't as bright. And there's also some tech now, some software that allows you to kind of pick out individual instruments a little bit.
Okay.
It's not perfect. There's always a bit of loss in fidelity, but it can be done.
In a pinch.
I don't lead with that.
Yeah.
I usually don't mention it.
Okay.
And there's actually software where you can just turn the vocal up or down.
Okay.
But again, it always comes at a little bit of a cost. So I prefer to not that's in case of emergency, basically.
In case of emergency. Okay.
Yeah. Like they can't get it changed in the mix.
Okay.
Super tight timeline.
Yeah.
Which everyone seems to be on some kind of emergency.
It's coming out tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And, so those things are much more feasible now. Like you can do that more now than you could 10 years ago, even. Yeah.
Okay. So maybe we can think about if you're going to use one of these tools to adjust a vocal level.
Yeah.
So again, some listeners might not understand that. Like you got your two speakers, your left and right.
Yep.
And you tend to hear the vocal up the middle.
Yes.
But really, like it is coming out both left and right, but it's like it's sounding mono because of the way our brain interprets it.
The phantom image.
Yeah. So if you're using one of these tools to adjust the vocal in this sense, there must be stereo imaging concerns?
It's more a concern of it shouldn't affect the stereo imaging if the tool works properly.
If it's okay. Yeah.
The issue is more artifacts from the process.
Like digital sounding.
Yes.
Artifacts.
So you're basically telling the software, like, locate just the vocal and move that up. But there would be things in the primary vocal range that maybe like that snare drum does get a little brighter. Or like it drags up a little bit of like with it because it's trying to figure out the difference between the vocal and the maybe sustain of the snare drum. And then there may be resonances in the vocal in an unexpected spot that it's not kind of looking for it. Okay. And it kind of doesn't bring those up as much. So there's it's like real subtle artifacts, but it's more that kind of thing.
Yeah. Okay. And if it's a very beautiful, natural sounding vocal, the last thing you want to do is have some sort of digital artifact hanging in the background or whatever.
Exactly. Okay. Exactly. Yeah.
So that's where someone who's like a really solid mixing engineer who's able to carve out like frequency spaces for each instrument, I suppose that would help in this emergency situation.
It does. Yeah. The more clarity there's in the mix, the better that software will work.
Okay.
Yeah. So if there isn't, say, muddiness in the acoustic guitar that is also blending in with the low end of the vocal, it's easier to separate that.
It's easy for,
Yeah.
That's very cool. That's really interesting. So it's nice to have those kind of tools in a worst case scenario, but you don't really want to like rely on them.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it. That's a good lesson for anyone listening. Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe we could think more about stereo imaging. Just before we went live there, just before I hit record, you were talking about how sometimes you have to like zero out your equipment or verify that I guess it would probably be called in phase, keeping it in phase. Is that the way to say that? Or?
Yeah, or it's really at that point just balancing the level.
Okay.
So keeping the level, centered. So, if you're not familiar with how stereo works, we have a left speaker and a right speaker or earbud or whatever. And then we have the phantom image in the center. And something that is perfectly centered means 50% of the sound is coming out of the left speaker and 50% is coming out of the right speaker. And that's what makes it perfectly centered. So if you start shifting that to like 52% of it is coming out of the left and 48 is coming out of the right, then it starts to cheat a little bit to the left.
Okay. Starts to lean or feels like it's leaning in that direction.
Yeah. And if you're not careful, if your gear isn't kind of specifically made for mastering and it's not very, very accurate, then you could even get into a situation where you've boosted a certain part of the vocal range and you think you've boosted it, 1 dB on each side, but one side went by 1.3 dB. And now like that certain part of the vocal range is kind of pulling a little bit. And all these things add up. There's a cumulative effect where just like the clarity of the mix disappears and the ability for us to locate instruments or reverbs or whatever within the mix is diminished.
As a listener, you mean?
As a listener, yeah. Those things are diminished because they're just not as accurate. So it's confusing to the ear and actually to the brain. Yeah.
To the brain. So maybe a listener who's obviously, a lot of listeners wouldn't be hip to this, but they might feel like uncomfortable or like they feel like something's off and they can't really identify it.
Yeah. It's just those small little gains that we're always trying to make, that people work hard right from the placing of the first microphone right to the end to try to maintain as much as possible.
Okay. Yeah, and it has to go through many hands and many pieces of equipment, generally speaking.
Right. So if you're losing a little bit at every step, then it's an issue. Yeah.
Okay. So in that regards, I feel like I'm just assuming that people are more familiar with like how a mixing or tracking studio looks. Yeah. With like the console with tons of faders and that sort of thing.
Yep.
Whereas like mastering, like I'm sitting in here, I've never really been in a mastering studio. I don't think I've been in like a specific mastering studio.
Dedicated, yeah.
Yeah, dedicated, that's the word.
Yeah.
And so you kind of got like your little spaceship console there in front, and you've only got far field speakers, is that?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so the equipment would have to be more precise, I'm imagining.
Yep.
So when you're buying equipment for mastering, you'd want to specifically stick to brand names or pieces of gear that's their specialty.
Yep, pretty much. I mean, I have a couple pieces that I use as options that you might find in a mix studio.
Okay.
One, basically. But yeah, for the most part, it's dedicated for mastering. It's almost too subtle to be fun for mixing, like as a piece of gear.
Too subtle. Like you can't hear the changes.
Yeah, like why did I pay all this money for an EQ that's not like giving it a tone? You know? But I'm trying to not impart much of a tone.
Okay, yes.
With what I do, right? So
you don't want anyone to know you've been there, basically.
Yeah.
Okay.
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, not quite to that extent. Like there's some tube gear here and stuff that has a tone to it, but it's on a much more subtle level than you would expect, like for mixing gear. Okay. Yeah.
And maybe talk about the speakers a little bit, because I imagine a lot of people doing, even at home recording, they're familiar with like near field speakers, and they might wonder why there's no near fields in the studio.
Yeah. Yeah. I can just get a little better image this way. Okay. Everything is measured, right? So there's a mark here just under the rug on the floor where I sit, and there's marks at the back of the desk, and everything in this room has been designed around creating this one sweet spot. Okay. So the distance of the speakers, the height of the speakers from the floor, the distance of the speakers from the outer walls, from the ceiling, like it's all engineered and designed, math way beyond what I understand with it, to make that where I sit as accurate as possible. Okay. Because I have to know when I make a change to something that it's actually the change I'm intending. Okay. So, for example, most people have never been in a room that's actually, I don't want to say it's 100% flat in terms of the EQ response, but it's pretty damn close. So most people have never been in a room like that. So what happens in most rooms is you're sending all these waves out into the room. They're reflecting off the walls, the ceiling, the floor. And then they're reflecting back, and some of them are mingling around your ears. And if a trough of a wave, like so when the same signal, the wave starts reacting with the other waves, essentially they can create dips or peaks in that frequency. Okay. So like, let's just keep it super simple. I send out a 60 hertz wave. It hits the back wall of the room, and lo and behold, it arrives at exactly the same time at my ears as a 60 hertz wave coming directly from the speaker. If that happens exactly like that, I hear nothing. Right? They cancel each other out. Okay. Or they double. It's not, the math isn't quite double, but, or they build up. So the issue is if you're trying to actually work on the music, you're getting a false picture. Yeah. So in that room, if I have that 60 hertz issue, I hear that. I'm like, holy crap, there's no 60 hertz in this track. I better add a lot of 60 hertz. Yeah. Well, there could be lots of 60 hertz already. I just can't hear it. Mm-hmm. So now I've got twice as much 60 hertz as I need, when really maybe I should have been cutting instead of boosting, right? So so that's one frequency. But then you continue that. We kind of work between, I mean, basically it'd say like 20 hertz to 20,000 hertz is like our hearing range in a perfect world as a baby.
Yep.
So we're working within that range, and there's that potential issue all the way through it. So,
okay.
Yeah, you just don't want to be in a situation where your room is lying to you, basically, and then you're making decisions based on that.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a good lesson for anyone, or a good lesson for anyone at home who's just kind of in their room doing whatever. Like, I think everyone's had that feeling who's in that situation where they mix it and it sounds awesome when they're sitting in front of their computer, and they toss it in their car, and they're like, what's going on here? This is not at all what I thought it sounded like. Yeah. So would you recommend, like, maybe that's the first area of investment for someone, is even if they don't have the ability to build a dedicated studio, but maybe treat the room as best as they can? As best they can, yeah. Get some, it's really easy to make absorbers, so you can just buy like sound insulation. It's a little more dense than regular insulation, and create a cheap wooden frame and get some, like I always used to go to Fabricville and just grab like whatever was in the bargain bin. This stuff in this room now was bought like purpose built for it, but basically if you need fabric to put over sound stuff, if you can breathe through it comfortably, it's good to go. If it's too thick, it'll reflect. Oh, yes, of course. Right? You want the waves to get through to the insulation. You don't want higher frequencies will bounce right back off it. Lower frequencies would go through. Now we just have a whole other problem. Right? There is software now like Sound ID. It used to be SonarWorks, where you can get a little mic. It comes a few $100s. It comes with a microphone. It runs tones through your room. It reads your room and then it adjusts your EQ. Neat. It's not perfect, but the cool thing is you get a reading of your room as well. So now you can say like, I have a lot of 60 hertz. You go on the forums, you find out, how do I control 60 hertz? Yes. You work a little towards that. You do another reading. It's a little better. And so you can't rely on it entirely, because it does some weird things, especially like the more adjustment it has to do, the weirder it gets. It also doesn't help with like distortion and reflections that are like obscuring your thing's placement within the stereo field. But yeah, I mean, that's the best place to start. So you want to get the best speaker you can kind of afford, and then put the rest of your energy into your room. And that's why a lot of people go with headphones too, right? When they're starting, because at least you're eliminating the issue of the room. But that's also not a perfect solve, because in the real world, we get crosstalk where things aren't just going, like the left speaker doesn't just go to your left ear, it bleeds over to your right ear as well. So headphones don't simulate that. They'll still create the phantom image, but it's a different thing. So they're not a perfect solution, but can be really great. Like if you're in your bedroom and you just don't have an opportunity to, do any sound treatment or cool. Very cool. But it's massive, because otherwise you really don't know. Like, it is wild how much it can shift it. It's probably, maybe it's kind of similar, or not similar, but it's like, if you're doing photography and the lights are coloring the scene, or like you're trying to paint an image and the lights in your room are like too yellow, so you like your canvas is not exactly what you're looking at. That's a great analogy. If you're doing video editing and your screen, like your tint is off on your screen, monitor, or your contrast or whatever, then you would make an adjustment so it looks right to you. But your monitor's lying to you, so when it goes out in the world, it's going to look different. Light's a lot easier to control than sound. Interesting. That's really cool. So is part of the mastering gig would be if perhaps people in the mix have made some of these mistakes, or their room was lying to them during a mix. Is that where a mastering engineer can kind of step up and quote unquote fix things? That's where you're helping. I mean, in some cases fix stuff. Most common with the low end. That is the trickiest thing to control in a room. That's what most of my time was put into. I'd say most of this is geared towards that low end. So that is my most common thing, where if I have to make a large adjustment, then that's where it's going to be. That's where it's going to be. It's going to be in the low end. And that's just because it's just those waves they're literally bigger, so they're harder to contain or control. They're huge.
like, I don't know, 20 hertz wave is like 60 feet long or something.
Yeah.
Like, it's absurd. Yeah.
Okay.
The math behind it's all really very cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
But they are just bigger and harder to contain. And also, bass travels omnidirectionally, so it goes in all directions at once.
Okay.
And it's it doesn't happen like it's kind of a continuum, spectrum of like it moving, very low frequencies moving in all directions. And as we move into higher frequencies, they start to become more direct. Mm-hmm. And then we get to really high frequencies, they're very, like, they come just right at you.
Okay.
And that has, so if you think of like S's or like a whisper or something, it comes very directly at you. That's why everyone knows that experience of being outside, hearing a car drive by, and all you hear is the bass, because that bass is going everywhere, but like you're not hearing the high end.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's partly, that phenomenon is partly how we locate something within a space. So if we hear something without a lot of high end, we perceive it as being further away. People hypothesize that goes to kind of the survival instinct of like, if a stick breaks at a distance, kind of keeping an eye on it. If a stick breaks very close to you, it requires immediate attention, right? So that's how we one of the ways we locate that is how much high end there is something. Okay. So that's another way you can kind of create space within a mix.
Okay. Do artists ever ask you to like do that sort of effect like on a track, like have frequencies fading out or fading in? Does it ever get into that? Like the song's fading out, but can you roll off the high end? We didn't do it in the mix. Can you roll it off as it fades out or anything like that?
Yeah, nothing that specific. Sometimes you get requests where they'll want, maybe they think like the chorus needs to be a little brighter.
Okay.
So if like relative to the rest of the mix, that makes sense. So then I'll have to automate something in to that chorus.
Just to occur during the chorus?
Yeah.
Okay.
Because otherwise I would just be moving the whole mix up.
Okay.
A certain amount.
Yeah.
But they might say the whole, I add, this is super generic, say I add 1 dB of high end, nondescript high end to a mix, but they feel the chorus needs to be a little brighter, then I might automate in an extra half dB in just the chorus. So every once in a while.
Okay.
But you will notice too, like that's another big issue is when you're listening back to something, our listening isn't linear depending on how loud the music is. So at a very low level, we perceive high end more readily. Okay. Again, it's that whisper thing.
Like low volume, you hear the high.
Yeah, low volume. So if you think of a track fading out or a track just playing quietly in the car, you're not really listening to it. Yeah. You're going to hear the S's, or if you keep turning it down and there's a tambourine, last thing you're going to hear is the tambourine before you hear nothing. Okay. So at a low volume, you can really perceive the high end differently. As the level comes up, it kind of trades off at about 83 decibels. It's pretty balanced, which is about the level I listen to in the room. Okay. And then as you keep cranking the volume up, then the bass becomes more apparent. Okay. Yeah, and the high end becomes less apparent.
High end becomes less apparent.
So along with dialing your room in, so it's giving you an accurate, frequency response, you also have to be mindful of the level you're listening to. So like you could and also when you're comparing things, if you don't match the level, then louder always sounds better. Yeah. Unless it's like really bad. That you can hear through that, but we're all fooled by louder, brighter. Yeah. Yeah.
I think, okay. So, and louder feels better too. Like it's more fun to be listening to loud music. Yeah. But I actually agree. Sometimes there'll be a plugin that when you have a setting on it, it might default to like have a makeup gain of 5 dB or something when you don't necessarily need that, and you think it's doing this cool thing.
Oh, they're aware. They know the plugin makers know the trick.
So everyone should keep that in mind. But it's worth it's probably worth repeating that people should listen to their mixes when they're doing like analytical listening at all levels, right?
Yes.
Like all volumes, I mean.
Yes. Yeah. Now, so it's a little different perspective with mixing because you might want to hear. There's certain information you might get about the mix when it's at a lower level. You can actually hear distortion a little more readily.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So you might, mixers over time, I think, develop tricks where like, I'll turn it down when I want to hear the vocal balance. Or that's when I'll listen on these little speakers.
Oh, like those little Oratone cubes or whatever, right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So those are great for setting like things in a certain frequency range. Okay. And making sure like the guitars aren't getting in the way of the vocal. The vocal's not too loud because as we go to more like mid-centric speakers or like certainly phones, they'll like push a vocal forward a lot. So then the mix engineer will kind of use different listening situations, different setups to inform them of different things. They all kind of have their own workflow for that, but they'll use it. It's more of like an information thing.
Okay.
So for me, I don't use anything else now. I just use this one setup, and I know I'm always listening to music in here, and I have reference tracks, and I know that if it sounds great in here, then it should sound maybe not great, but as expected on every other listening device.
Okay.
So if it sounds like the other tracks in the genre in here, when they listen to their phone, it will sound crappy in the same way all the other tracks do.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah, so it's not going to sound great.
Yeah.
But it's going to sound crappy in the way they expect it to.
In the way
based on all their favorite music that they listen to on their phone.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I do remember. So I used to watch, I still watch it from time to time, but Pensato's Place. YouTube, YouTube.
It's like an OG.
Oh man, yeah. I was blown away when he started interviewing people like 10 years ago or whatever, and I was like, man, they're just giving away all their secrets.
Yeah.
But he would talk about that you have this huge studio, and then all of a sudden it's coming down now where everyone wants the phone test, So of course you're like shrinking down this huge process to be played out of someone's the speaker on their phone.
Yeah. It's kind of, you start with a $15,000 microphone, and it all comes down to that.
Yeah. But I mean, that's what the people. I mean, at the end of the day, it's what the consumer wants to be listening to, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's what it comes down to.
I mean, it's, the practicality of having a really dialed listening space in your home even it's hard.
Yeah.
So when you come down to wanting to have it portable and whatever.
It's hard to beat. How do you approach, so vinyl's kind of on the up and up. I guess it's been a few years. Cassettes are coming back.
Yeah.
How does mastering change when you're going from like a digital file or a CD to like preparing for vinyl? Or I don't even know if it's different for cassette personally, but I know it would be different for vinyl.
Yeah, cassette is more similar to vinyl. Okay. Because you're working within that physical medium. Tape handles level a little differently than vinyl does. Okay. I actually have a small vinyl lathe in the other room just for doing individual cuts.
Oh, it's for cutting?
Like lathe cuts.
Oh, cool.
So like one at a time kind of stuff.
And would that be for... what's it called? Like a test pressing or?
No, so that's like if somebody wanted just a super short run of like 10 or 20, then I can do that versus typically you send the tracks off and they get like a master vinyl cut and then it's plated and pressed from there. Okay. Whereas these ones I start with a plastic disc and I cut right into it and hand it over to you.
So technically everyone might be slightly different just by microns or something.
Oh yeah. Yeah. For sure. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
All right, so let's get back to how is it different from the mastering approach when you're making these decisions?
Yeah, so in the digital world, we can push things pretty loud, where there's a fixed kind of, if you're in we'll just say it's a fixed zero, that is a ceiling. So you can push up to that ceiling, and as long as nothing is going past it, it won't distort. When you get past zero in digital, it very quickly just becomes, and it's like an unpleasant distortion. And it's not linear. It's like not distorting. Like there's no kind of build up to it.
Oh, okay. It's kind of like flipping a switch.
It's just boom. It just crosses that line and it's red. Yeah. In the analog world, distortion is more, it's more like non-linear. So like you could have like a pleasant amount. I mean, all analog gear has some kind of inherent level of distortion. So you could have, kind of increasing distortion as it goes, and it just distorts a little more. And then you can kind of, there's a point, like a different point for everyone where they might call that an issue. Okay. Listen to lots of old stuff, like Motown stuff is kind of notorious for being really distorted. Okay. Because they were, it was kind of a fly-by-night thing. I mean, the artistry is amazing, but like they had to figure out a lot of stuff on the fly in terms of like building the studio, and it's amazing like what they were able to accomplish kind of starting from scratch. And that gear back then was way less forgiving than now, right? So to work that gear and even get it sounding as good as it did was pretty amazing, because they weren't part of like a lineage where like if you were at a studio in the UK, well, they've been making records for years and people have come before you and made mistakes and whatever. Yeah. But just to buy that gear and try to figure it out. I don't know. So I don't mean to sound like I'm criticizing the distortion, and maybe that's part of the character. it certainly has a certain charm, some of it, but also like artistically, it's just unreal what they were creating. But if you want to hear some stuff that's a little distorted, maybe in like in kind of an analog way, then Motown's a good place to go. Yeah.
Cool.
So in the analog, it's not as black and white as like you cross the zero and it distorts.
Okay.
So that changes things a little bit. Analog also, though, that it can't handle the same amount of level typically that digital can.
Okay.
So when we get into vinyl, we're talking about that. And this applies to tape as well to a different degree. We're dealing with physical space. So we have to put sound into a groove. We have to put, cuts into a groove. And the louder it is, the bigger the groove has to be.
Like the deeper the groove on the physical.
Right.
record.
So it kind of cuts in like a wedge. So deeper means wider as well.
Deeper means wider. Oh, okay.
Yeah. So it's
less songs per side.
Yeah, exactly. So you can't, first of all, push as loud a signal in.
Okay.
And you're right. It means, less, you have less time. Louder means less time.
Louder means less time.
Also, and then you're also playing with like, well, how much, because frequencies take up a physical space. So low end takes up more space on a vinyl. So then you're also kind of like, how much low end? Well, if maybe I cut the low end, maybe I can pack these grooves a little tighter and then I can get more space. So there's this like constant balancing that the cutting engineers have to go through.
Okay.
Which is, very tricky and somewhat unpredictable. Like it reacts differently. And anyway, so vinyl, basically from my end, if I'm sending something out to vinyl, I just have to send a quieter version of the mix that doesn't have the limiters on it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. That makes me think of like the double records I would have sometimes, and I'd be like kind of annoyed that I have to like switch it after 2 or 3 songs. And then some records would just have like 6 or 8 songs up per side.
Yeah.
That must be why, right? I bet if I paid attention, the level and the low end information's different.
When you look at like audiophile jazz albums will sometimes just be like a song per side.
Wow.
They're 45s,
which
is the same as being at like a higher resolution essentially.
Okay.
Because the vinyl's spinning faster, so it's spreading the information out over a larger area. Yeah. Which means a higher sound quality. Because I mean, I could go on and on about this because then the needle has to read whatever you cut, right? Yeah. So you drop your stylus on the vinyl and it's spinning, and it's kind of like it has to run an obstacle course. Okay. And imagine, and this is why when you get to the center, you start moving towards the center of the vinyl, the sound can get pretty rough and you can start like, you will get distortion.
Yeah, I noticed that. Actually.
Yeah. So it's called inner groove distortion.
Okay, cool.
It's partly to do with the angle of the tone arm and how that affects the stylus. But basically, like if you think about it like this, so on the outside of the disc, I think it takes like 1.8 seconds for it to do like a full revolution. Well, it's traveling the full circumference nearly of that 12-inch vinyl. As you get to the center, it's still 1.8 seconds, but that information, that 1.8 seconds of information, instead of being packed into this long groove all around the edge, is now packed into a much smaller groove. Okay. And the stylus has to navigate that. Okay. So imagine someone riding a bicycle and it's a kilometer and there's these like kind of undulating hills. Yeah. Okay. Now imagine you took all of those hills and put them into like 100 meters. Okay. Right? And they're just like going along. That's what your stylus is doing. Okay. And then also the louder it is, it kind of has to like slalom back to side to side to side. Okay. So the more it has to move, the more distortion you're going to get. Yeah. And the faster. Yeah. And then also like, because it's all geometry. So you've got like the grooves are basically like, a cut open into it. And as you start packing them tighter, those little slices get tighter and tighter. And then that's why high end disappears, because high end are really tiny slices. But as they start to close up, it's not that it's not in the vinyl. It's that your stylus can't fit in that groove anymore because it's closed up on it. Okay. So those tiny little high end things, it can't get in there anymore to recreate the high end.
Okay.
So it's not always an issue even with the cutting. It's an issue with playback and just
that's where the quality of your record player would. I'm assuming some high end record players would be able to compensate for these things, or
at some point they can't.
At some point
it's better.
Okay.
Yeah, they get it better, but at some point it's just like you just can't get in. Like you just can't get in because it's if say a vinyl lathe can cut comfortably up to definitely like 16,000 hertz, right? Yeah. So that's 16,000 vibrations per second to recreate that frequency.
Okay.
So they're small.
That's small. Yeah.
Yeah. It's wild. The whole thing is magic. It's how they ever figured it out and made it work. It's just an unbelievable feat of engineering.
Yeah. Pretty incredible.
Yeah. And it sounds so good. It's crazy that you think like it's just this little diamond and it's just waggling around on this, on this lacquer, and then they plate it with metal, and then they plate it again, and they plate it again, and then they take a stamper and a hot puck of plastic or vinyl and squish it, and then you listen to it and you're like, that sounds amazing. How is that even possible?
It's crazy, right?
Yeah, and then you put it on this other thing that goes and follows, like it waggles back and forth between, two pickups, kind of basically, and creates like an field that reads it back through, and then the speakers vibrate. Like, it's wild. The whole thing is wild.
Yeah, that's insane.
Like I kind of understand how it works pretty well, but like then there are moments where you're just like, but how?
Yeah.
How is this possible?
Yeah. How did they figure it out?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so wild. And then you compare that to the digital world where it's just like a file in some mysterious location and, Control C if you want to make endless copies of your track.
Right. I mean, I think that's something you just see with tech in general. Like to evolve digitally is fairly simple because you're just manipulating zeros and ones. But, if you wanted to try a new approach to, anything back in the day, cars or whatever, like, we want to try adding a turbo. Well, let's spend 6 months building this turbo to put on this airplane engine or whatever, and we put it on there. Nope, that didn't work. Well, let's try change it. Okay, I'll see you in 6 months.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's not like, let me just play with the code here. There you go. Yeah.
You can model. Yeah, that's a good point.
It's all physical, so it's the R&D behind it is very time consuming. And a lot of trial and error.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Now I'm kind of over the whole digital versus analog debate, but do you personally think anything is lost in the digital realm, or like do you view one as being like better is not the right word, but do you have a preference that maybe?
Yeah, I'm pretty agnostic on that. I don't think it's that anything is lost in the digital. I think it's what's not lost.
What's not lost?
What's not lost, because now there was a phase when digital was developing that was introducing a lot of harsh artifacts and aliasing, distortion, and all that, which is a whole rabbit hole. You can debate all of that, and whether it's audible or perceivable, or whether it's perceived but not audible, and there's a whole a whole thing there.
I'd say go listen to Californication, the album.
Yeah, well, that's just straight up distorted.
That's a good example.
Another level. Yeah,
that's a good example of what
that and Metallica's Death Magnetic is known for being like the jumping the shark moment.
Yeah, jumping the shark.
So I think if analog has a charm, it's in what it removes.
Okay.
So digital will recreate really accurately whatever you throw at it, as long as your gear's good. And now, for the most part, even most gear is pretty good. So it will recreate that, but it's a question of whether you want whether you want it warts and all.
Okay.
Where analog, depending on what era you're talking about, if you're talking about recording to tape, then like this would be one example. Like tape would not respond as quickly to the signal. There's a little bit of a lag there. So you've got it's a whole thing. So you've got like, say, a tube microphone. And the tube microphone doesn't respond as quick as like a solid state microphone.
Okay.
And then so it doesn't catch every little thing. So maybe the S's they get a little rounded off. Okay. And then it goes to tape, same process happens. It kind of rounds off the S's a little bit, and then you get something in the end that sounds very natural.
Okay.
When suddenly you stop rounding that off, all of a sudden the S's are just coming right out at you.
Okay.
Right? So maybe you don't want all of that.
Yeah.
Right? I think of
Interesting.
The kind of dermatology mirrors or whatever, there's lighting where it's kind of like soft or whatever, and then there's those mirrors where you can see all of your pores and everything.
Yeah.
That's basically what digital is.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's a cool way to
So you can't really, nowadays where the tech is there, that you can't really blame digital for anything, but it, in some ways, analog still can help you out a lot. Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
So it's not, it's like, it's what analog takes away, but that can sometimes add to the project.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's really interesting.
Yeah. Just kind of rounds out the edges.
Yeah.
A little bit.
Softens it up.
Yeah. And it's introducing harmonics as well through that, because there's always, like I said, there's always that like inherent distortion in it.
Yeah.
But that can also add a certain richness to it. And because sound recording is weird. We're not actually, in most cases, going for realism. And even when we are, we're getting it to trying to get it not to be realistic, but to feel realistic. And they're two different things.
And when you say realistic, you mean like what the person might hear if they're in the room in the moment?
Yeah.
Okay. Versus what they hear out of their speakers.
Yeah, because it's different when it comes out of a speaker.
Yeah.
So compression, you mentioned that earlier. That's a good example. Our ears actually physically compress when sounds get loud. So when we hear a compressed sound, we feel that it's loud. Right? So it's not always, sometimes the illusion of feeling loud and not actually, well, I mean, and then you can adjust it with your volume. But some of the things, some of the artifacts that people will try to get out of compressors will be to recreate the compression that happens to our ears, that it's almost chaotic. And like if you've been in the room with a drummer playing really loud, like it does feel like it's pushing in, on your head, and you can feel it kind of flattening out, almost just like a compressor would. So it kind of recreates that feeling a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wonder if that's why, like, that piece of gear, the 1176.
Yeah.
Like, I feel like you can hear, like, in a mix, it's like, oh, that's someone's cranked the 1176 on that snare. It's like you can feel it go, whoa, like that weird breath feeling.
Yeah. And in that moment, if you're live in the room with a snare drum that's really loud, it kind of feels like that. The difference is, it's so loud, you're also like probably trying to flee from it. So you're not able to listen in the same way because your body's like literally in like a panic mode. Like, I gotta get the hell out of here.
Yeah.
At least that's how I am.
Yeah.
And the snare's that loud.
Yeah, me too. Yeah. Because once you understand the damage it can do to physically to your ears, and I mean, you rely on your ears for your day-to-day job. So.
Yeah, I'm such a baby about loud stuff that I've got.
You gotta be.
Yeah.
Hear some horror stories when people get older.
Yeah.
So.
And that's another, I mean, one of the things is it's hard for me. I spend a lot of my day like listening for little vocal clicks and things, and super focused listening.
Yeah.
And then I go in to eat dinner. Yeah. And everyone's chewing, and I'm like, oh my God, could they chew? So we actually have a thing like we always have music or something on when we eat, because I can't eat by myself. Yeah. Without something on, because I just can't. So like you get so tuned in, and then you go home and you're just like, chewing gravel? Like, what's going on over there?
That's hilarious. Some white noise. Just you need something to round off the edges.
Yes. Yep. Well, and that's also another part of analog, is there's a noise floor to it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Of course, the noise floor.
Yeah.
Yes.
Which is pretty high on vinyl.
Yeah.
And tape. Stuff.
Okay. Yeah, because some of that hiss is why some people would point to vinyl as their preferred medium, just because they enjoy that.
Yeah, there's a certain nostalgia or a certain charm to it, and it's all viable. And that's the thing, like, everyone's always, like you were saying, you're kind of over the digital analog debate, as am I. Everyone's always trying to prove something that's unprovable. It's an experience that everyone has when they listen to music, and they're free to experience it however they want. Yeah. They can spend $200,000 on an audiophile system and do that and listen a certain way, or they could listen on their iPhone and love it just as much. And it's really about how you want to connect with stuff. So there really aren't any rules with that,
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Once I had that click in my brain that I didn't really care about that anymore, like I started to appreciate like lo-fi music, for example, like bands who would purposely sound like they recorded on a tape deck, and that was part of the aesthetic. Yeah. Whereas like in the past, when I used to be kind of audiophile-ish, I would just write off that art to begin with, because I was like, why would you record it this way? And just like shove it aside. Yeah. So kind of when you kind of let go of that, I feel like it can unlock that in yourself.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of how I handle every track that comes in, is I kind of meet, like I was saying, I meet it where it's at. So it's the same thing. You can think of listening the same way too. Like, I grew up in the Beatles, and like, the production on that is amazing in a specific way, and certainly when you take it into a historical context, but like, it's not audiophile. you know, but it's amazing.
It's right for what it should be or supposed to be.
Yeah. I mean, if you're specifically talking, I mean, you can enjoy it in an audiophile setting, but if you're really talking about like the purity of like the fidelity and the transients and the space and stuff, well, that's not really where it's at. Like a lot of that stuff is probably like when you get into early recordings, it's a lot of jazz stuff that would just record really well with one microphone or two microphones in a space.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Because it's a more pure signal.
Yeah.
But that's if you want to go there, right?
Yeah.
Like that's getting onto one extreme.
Yeah. Okay. But yeah, which can have artistic merit too. So kind of all these things kind of play into how the performance is captured or how the performance is performed, like how that can all affect it.
Yeah. I mean, you can, again, like music is such a personal experience. You know, you could listen to just lyrics and be really focused on that and not really care about the audio quality. I mean, just the vocal performance, or you could be more focused on the lyrics and not really care about the vocal performance.
Yeah.
You know, and then you can get to the point where like I really enjoy listening to some audiophile jazz stuff and it just makes me happy to hear, because I know I can hear that it's two microphones in a room, and when the drummer plays a little louder and the cymbal starts to kind of stretch to the left because that's where the piano microphone was.
Okay.
And I'm like, oh, that's cool. And I can hear the back of the room now. And like, so sometimes it's fun to listen that way. And you're like, well, what are they playing? Like, oh, I don't know. I was listening to the room.
That's cool.
You know, so, cool. And that's totally fine too. Like whatever. Yeah. So the whole like snobby thing about it is just stupid. And you can get into the digital analog side of that. It's all has value. And yeah,
I completely agree. And not quite the same, but like in terms of like being too perfectionist, like you can look up on YouTube people listening to like Michael Jackson tracks that are isolated. You can hear headphone bleed and his amazing vocal take, and you're like, wow, it doesn't really have to be so clean. Yeah. Just in general.
Yeah. Slippery slope.
Slippery slope.
Yeah, and that is part of the artistry of being a good engineer or a good producer, is knowing like at what point does this pursuit interfere with the artistry.
Yes.
Like, we could spend all day tuning in the headphones, but like by the end of the day, the singer's probably like, well, I'm going home.
Yeah.
I'm tired. You know? Yeah, so like at what point do you call it? And that's a bit of a personal thing. And you have to read the people in the room.
Yeah,
like,
that's a
drums
skill.
sound really good. I think I could get them to sound a little better, but like I can tell they're ready to do the take.
Exactly.
And this is going to be like, so you don't want to miss that moment of inspiration because you were twiddling some knobs.
Exactly.
You know? But you also have to twiddle the knobs.
Yeah.
So
at the same time, you don't want that perfect take to happen when the quality is subpar and you know it, and everyone but like you captured the take, but things weren't ready or whatever. Yeah. And so it goes both ways. Thread the needle, I guess.
Yeah.
Sure. So maybe to wrap it up, we could maybe we could give some listeners, like if someone's getting ready to send a master, because it feels like it's common to me for people to mix and master, and then there's that debate whether you should send it to an independent master just to have that fresh set of ears on it. So if someone wants to take that approach and they've done their own mix, are there any like kind of common tips or any kind of like guidelines you would give someone to prepare to send it to a mastering engineer?
Yeah. I mean, I think, so there is a lot of debate about that now too. I think a lot of it, shrinking budgets, like it's hard, it's just hard to make music when there's no income from making of music. Because sales are so tough. So that's very understandable. And I think like YouTube is always like throwing out a lot of information about like, it's actually really simple. Like it's just these three things. And, yes. But there's also just the repetition of those few things. Right. And that's where the skill comes in. Like someone could give me 3 steps. Like, here's how you do a cartwheel. Well, it's like, then watch me to try to do a cartwheel after those 3 things, right? It's not going to go well. It would take me thousands and thousands of repetitions. And that's what it is for me. Like, as a dedicated mastering engineer, a mix engineer might master a couple dozen tracks if that's part of their process. But where I'm doing like maybe 1,500 tracks a year, right? So it's just like repetition. And then the room also to be able to hear and all of that. But in terms of preparing it to send to mastering, there's always a lot of questions about limiters. Okay. Because some people like to mix into a limiter.
Like a bus limiter or...
exactly.
Master track limiter or whatever.
Exactly. So if you're talking about like there's a limiter on the drum bus or like a limiter on the vocal or the bass or something, like leave those on for sure.
Okay.
Some people put one on their master bus. Sometimes they'll do it just to get it up to level for the client so they can kind of get it approved.
Yeah.
And they'll just put it on at the last moment, kind of like, okay, I'm happy with the mix. Now I'll kind of get the level up a little bit, send it to the artist and see if they're happy with it.
Yeah, okay.
In that case, I would say send me both. Okay. So send me one with the limiter turned off, send me one with the limiter on. So I just kind of know what the artist was expecting.
Yeah.
So I've run into issues where it's like the mix engineer has sent them something that is just way too loud. Okay. Like it's distorted, but they're not picking up on it for some reason. Maybe their listening environment or whatever.
Yeah.
But I got to know if that's the level the artist expects.
Okay.
It's like, okay, well, buckle up, because they send something to the artist that's really loud. And if I don't give them something that loud, they're not going to be happy.
Gotcha.
Because they have that expectation of it being that loud. So I like to know what was approved.
Okay.
And then I would want a version without the limiter on so I can like dial it in a little more on my end. Yeah.
Okay.
Now, if you've mixed in now, so that's one way. Mm-hmm. So you put the limiter on at the end. If you have put the limiter on at the start or partway through the process and you've made your decisions going into the limiter, then I say leave it in.
Okay.
Same thing with compressors or anything. If it's been in there while you were mixing, when you pull it off, it's going to change the mix. And then I have to try and recreate your mix and then master it.
Gotcha.
Right? So like if it's been on the whole time, please go lightly on it. It's not unusual for me to get people who have done that and have a lot of distortion on the track, and sometimes I can't get it out.
Okay.
But I also get mixes that are mixed that way that sound amazing. Yeah. So, yeah.
So it's kind of like if it's part of the artistic process, leave it on.
Yep.
But if it's just boosting levels, well, I guess you just said give two versions. Yeah.
Yep. Just that, and basically, like, don't try to guess what I'm going to do. Like, just send me the mix that you love.
Oh, okay.
Some people will be like, well, and I know in mastering you like to do this and that. I'm like, whoa. Yeah. First of all, that's a YouTube thing, because it's very misleading about what, like, I do this on every master. And it's like, whoa, that's insane, So examples of that might be like, well, I know you like to widen it mastering, so I just went ahead and did it.
Yeah.
Stereo wideners can often come at a cost. And like, if you're mixing, you can just pan it wider.
Yeah.
Like, just make your mix wide.
Yeah.
I will use them sparingly on my end at like a tiny percentage and very rarely.
Okay.
And often for like really specific reasons that don't always have to do with widening. Like it's a whole thing. So that's one, I think. Yeah. If you want your mix wider, like, don't do it on your stereo bus unless you want an effect of it being a little swimmy or like it's an EDM track or something. It's a little different.
Okay.
You're going for a hyper real kind of thing. But yeah, so I wouldn't mess with wideners on your master bus unless you really like are specific. Like, I wouldn't do it just as like, oh, wide's cool. So this is a wide button. Yeah. Bright's cool. This is a bright button. Like, just do make your mix so that you love it. And then we're like in a better spot where we can kind of like communicate, and there's always can be a bit of that too, right?
Okay.
For me, I always know I can get it within a range for the genre, but then very few people are like, I am this genre. Bang, 100% this.
Yeah.
So then within that range, then if we really want to dial it in artistically, then we might shift things a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah. So like, I could do a perfectly suitable master, but it might not be exactly what the artist is looking for.
Okay.
Right? Like, they might want a little more low end for that genre or whatever, or a little more high end, but it tends to be in those extremes.
Okay.
But that's cool. That's when we are really like dialing it in, right? Because we're collaborating on it and moving that direction.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Maybe this might be a rabbit hole, so maybe we won't have time to talk about it, but if someone's like bouncing down the track and they're sitting there going like, what does dither mean? Do I put a dither on it? Do I bounce it down in 16-bit? Do I leave it at 24? Like, do you have any thoughts on? Oh yeah,
great question. You can actually just export mixes at 32-bit.
Okay.
Floating point or something like that? Yep, floating point, exactly. Which means if there is any distortion in it, I can remove it. As long as it's not the plugin itself distorting.
Okay.
But if you like sent it and it ended up going over 0 or whatever, then I can digitally like gain it down and it won't be distorted anymore.
Oh, cool.
If it's floating point.
Yeah.
And if it's not one of the plugins actually distorting.
Yeah. Okay.
So dither. If you're going to so DAWs, the software that you mix in, they all work at floating point now.
Okay.
So if you're exporting a mix, anytime you're changing the bit depth, you need to dither. Mm-hmm. So if you're working at 32 and you want to export me a mix that's 24-bit, then you should dither it.
Okay.
Probably better is just to do it at 32, though.
Okay.
Yeah, because then you don't have to dither it, and it's just that one less bit of processing. So then I have to dither it at the end because nothing goes out 32-bit to streaming platforms. So I will dither it at the end, and that just kind of avoids dithering it twice.
Okay.
Now, will it really make a difference? Probably not.
But it's best practice.
Best practice.
Yeah.
32-bit's great. Or like 24-bit. Definitely not. You don't want to send it out at 16.
You don't want to.
Because you will hear the difference between 24 and 16.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
Or it is audible, I should say. Like maybe on your, maybe it wouldn't bug you, or maybe you would like it better. Mm-hmm. There's always that possibility too. But yeah, I think 24, 32. And if you go at 24, just put a dither on.
Okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, leaving at 32 allows, I don't want to say more room for error, but it just gives you more options in case there's an emergency or something like that.
Yeah. But for some people, they have dither on their limiter, and it's just part of their workflow, and there's definitely a tone to it. Mm-hmm. So they might be already liking that tone. Yeah. So it's all totally fine. I just wouldn't do 16-bit.
Okay.
That said, we're always my job is to strive for those last couple percent. Mm-hmm. But any decision you've made about the snare drum EQ or the vocal EQ or the arrangement or all of these things are way more important. So cool. I would say you can do that as best practice, but don't stay up at night worrying about it. Okay. Cool. Worry about other things. Okay. Yeah.
And if someone's really, really determined to do it exactly right, they could just reach out to the mastering engineer like yourself before getting the files sent.
Yeah, just how do you like them sent? Yeah. Yep, that totally works. And yeah, I've worked, I don't know, I've had great tracks that have come in at MP3s because they're this is an old archival track.
Oh yeah, okay. It is what it is.
Mix engineer is gone, and computer died. We've got the MP3.
That's it.
It's okay, great. Yeah. It's still going to sound like your song.
Yeah.
It's still going to communicate. Yep. Audio files might poo-poo it.
Someone might notice.
They'll get over it.
It might be one of those, it might be like those wine competitions, though, where they were secretly feeding the judges, the worldwide judges, $8 wine. And that was the wine that was winning over the $1,000 bottle.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's the thing, too. We've kind of talked about how, digital is pristine quality, but it doesn't mean that's always what sounds best. Yeah. So maybe MP3 sounds better. Yeah. Subjectively. Mm-hmm. Especially if you grew up with it. It's just, that's what's in your brain. Yeah. Well, we kind of get wired for a certain thing too. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. All right, John, I really appreciate your time. This was super fascinating. I'm glad we got to nerd out a little bit. Covered quite a bit of ground, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Cool. Thanks for having me. Yeah.